This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the fourth Tuesday of every month throughout 2023, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West. I'm very excited about this year-long series, and I greatly appreciate the Nature Conservancy's generous support. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in Colorado and around the world, visit www.nature.org/Colorado. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Katharine is a world-renowned climate scientist, professor, and chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, where she leads and coordinates the organization's scientific efforts. She's also the author of Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world, an excellent book that you've likely heard me reference on the podcast. Whether you're interested in learning more about the facts, data, or projections regarding climate change, or if you're seeking instruction on how best to approach challenging conversations about climate, I highly recommend Saving Us. It's an optimistic, solutions-oriented guidebook for finding common ground and having productive conversations. Katharine was born and raised in Canada, and she's been obsessed with science, the natural world, and the universe for as long as she can remember. Her undergraduate studies focused on physics and astronomy, but as she was finishing up her degree, she happened to take a climate science course, which captured her imagination and changed the focus of her education and career. Today, Katharine is a distinguished professor at Texas Tech, a highly respected researcher, and a sought-after speaker with a TED Talk that's been viewed more than 4 million times. And to top it all off, in 2021, she joined the Nature Conservancy as its chief scientist. Katharine and I met up in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, where she was the keynote speaker at a community event focused on climate and climate change in the Yampa Valley and beyond. She and I chatted for an hour before her event, and we managed to cover a lot of ground. We talked about her book Saving Us, her TED Talk, and about a concept known as the 6 Americas of global warming. We talk about how and why her Christian faith plays such an important role in her work to solve climate change, and she offers some common sense, optimistic approaches to having challenging conversations with smart people who do not think that climate change is a threat. She also talks about her role at the Nature Conservancy, specific climate opportunities and challenges facing the American West, and she offers a ton of excellent book recommendations. A big thank you to Dr. Hayhoe for taking the time out of her busy schedule to chat with me, and thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy. Dr. Hayhoe, I am so happy to be talking with you. Thank you for taking the time. This might be one of the prettiest podcast locations I've had, right next to the Yampa River. Not bad.
Yeah, we're looking at out the windows at the snow and the mountains, and it's just gorgeous.
Well, we were just talking about before we started recording how you pack your days, and that's actually mentioned in your book as well, why you do that. But I just really appreciate you taking the time. And I wanted to start out talking about your book, which I loved. And people who listen to the podcast know that I'm just kind of obsessed with books from every angle. And I read like the acknowledgments and the endnotes and everything. And I actually skipped over this when I first read it. And then I saw it the other day, the dedication of the book. And it says, to everyone who believes the difficult issues in life are worth talking about. And I feel like that's such an awesome way to start this book, because it is about just having conversations and breaking down these barriers. And so I'd love to just hear, you've been doing this for a long time. Why did you decide to write this book? Was there an exact moment when you thought, all right, it's time to write a book?
Yes, I am not a big book writer. Books are a ton of work, and I'm not someone who loves to just sit down and write. It's something where you have to grit your teeth and sit down and make yourself do it.
Sure.
The reason I did, though, is because I talk to a lot of people. I speak with people all across the United States and, in fact, around the world. I talk with school kids and senior citizens, with business professionals and healthcare professionals, teachers and other scientists, people who work in state and federal and local government. And for a number of years now, I've been using a tool called Poll Everywhere, where I collect people's questions, and then people can upvote the questions they most want answered.
Yeah, I've seen that before.
Yes. And so in doing that, I started to see that no matter who I was speaking to, no matter where I was, the same two questions were rising to the top again and again. Mm-hmm. And those two questions are, what gives you hope? And how do I have a conversation about this issue? That's why I wrote the book, to answer those two questions.
And can you talk a bit about the experience of your TED Talk? Because I feel like your TED Talk may have been one of my first introductions to you, because I just love TED Talks. And yours, I mean, I had 4 or 5 million views, something like that. I mean, that's a lot of people.
Yes.
And so how did that come about? And had you, I mean, you're such a gifted speaker, such a gifted storyteller. What was that process like? Because I feel like maybe that TED Talk could have also kind of teed up the message of that led to this book.
It did. Well, my TED Talk is called "The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change is Talk About It." Mm-hmm. And where that idea came from is it came from public opinion data that I've been following. So I'm a physical scientist. I study the atmosphere. That's my background. But I very much respect the social scientists who study how we as humans interact with information. And I read their studies. I look at what they say about best practices for messaging. And I follow very closely what it is that people actually think, because often we make assumptions about what we think people are thinking. Mm-hmm. And then what we're doing is we're communicating to what we think they're thinking, not what they actually are thinking. So there's this amazing program called the Yale Program on Climate Communication, where they track public opinion on a whole bunch of different questions related to climate change for every county in the U.S. and for every congressional district.
Oh, wow.
And they ask people about 30 different questions. They've been tracking these questions for over a decade. So I was digging really deeply into their research, and I was seeing how there's maps of the whole U.S. showing that most people agree that climate is changing. Most people agree it will affect future generations. Most people agree that it will affect people living in developing countries or plants and animals. But then they ask people, do you think it will affect you? And all of a sudden the numbers flip. Most people didn't think it would affect them. And then there was one more question that was even more negative. It was, do you ever talk about it? And when I saw that result, that only about 30% of people in the U.S. talk about climate change even once in a blue moon, it was like a light bulb went off in my head. If we never talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything to fix it? So that made me realize that talking about something, using our voice to advocate for change, is an incredible catalyst for the action that we need.
One of the things that I just loved about your book is from the very first few pages, you make it clear that everything associated with climate change and really just life in general is complicated. And we're in this world now where it seems like every day people are trying to box people in to climate denier or climate change believer, mm-hmm. When there's nothing about believing. But early on in the book, you lay out the 6 different types of climate change. Global Warming 6 Americas. And I'd never seen that. Can you go through those real quick and then talk about the far extreme 7%?
Yes. So the 6 Americas of global warming is another product that comes out of the same Yale group I just talked about, mm-hmm. who makes those amazing maps. And we often divide people into 2 groups, people who accept or don't accept climate change. But what they found is that we actually fall into at least 6 groups. And at the far end, we have people who are alarmed. Then next to them, you have people who are concerned about climate change. Then you have people who are cautious. And what's really interesting is cautious people often lead with their doubts. So cautious people often get categorized or stereotyped as people who don't accept the science. But what they're really doing is they're asking questions because they're not sure. They're cautious. And alarmed, concerned, and cautious people make up about 80% of America.
Wow.
80%.
That's great.
Then you have people who are disengaged. Mm-hmm. A very small number is disengaged, the people who've been living under a rock the last 20 years. About 12% are doubtful. They're pretty hardcore. They watch Fox News all the time. They know all the talking points about how scientists fake the data they claim or that the Earth isn't warming. But doubtful people, you can have a conversation if you begin where they're at. And at the very end of the spectrum, 8% are dismissive. And I really like that word dismissive. It's better than denier because denier is a label that gets thrown around all too frequently. And denier is basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, you're on that side, I'm on this side, and we're never going to meet on anything. But dismissive is accurate because a dismissive person will dismiss everything. They will dismiss 200 years of climate science, 2,000 climate scientists, 2 million climate science studies. My personal definition of a dismissive is if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone that said global warming is real appeared in front of a dismissive person, they would dismiss them too. Mm-hmm. Dismissive people are the loudest voices, commenting on news articles online, your uncle on Facebook, the trolls on Twitter. So often when I say we need to talk about climate change, people assume, oh, well, I need to go have a conversation with an 8%er. No, the 8%ers are the only ones that we cannot have a positive, constructive conversation with. Mm-hmm. But the good news is 92% of us are not dismissive. We're worried about climate change, but here's another really interesting fact. Only 8% of us are activated. So you've got 8% dismissive at one end. You've got only 8% who are activated at the other. What is the goal of our conversation? It's not to make people more worried. People are already worried. They're not activated. Mm-hmm. We've got this huge number of people in the middle. 84% of people are not activated on climate change. And those are the people that we need to be having these conversations with about why climate change matters and about what we can do about it, how we can activate ourselves.
I love that. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that I've had this idea that it's just the people on the extremes making the most noise. And everybody else in the middle is just kind of like, I don't want any part of this. It's crazy. Yeah. But your book puts these statistics to it that makes it so much easier for me to understand. So I love that. And speaking of these binaries and where people, you're either in or you're out, you're in my group or you're not, you cross over in a very unique way statistically because of your Christian faith. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's a really cool way that you've been able to go into these groups. You know, for some reason, Christian groups are more likely to not believe in climate change. And you've been able to go in and establish these core values and work from there up. And it's been such a productive way to go about it. Can you talk a bit about that? I mean, this is a huge part of the book. And we were talking before we started recording your interview with Krista Tippett. I'll link to that in the notes so people can listen because it's so inspiring for me to hear. But can you just talk a bit about how you are able to kind of make headway with a group that if some atheist showed up scolding them, it wouldn't work very well?
It wouldn't. And I think, first of all, let's generalize that. The place to begin a positive conversation is with something we agree on.
I agree, yep.
Not something we disagree on. And so a couple of times this has happened. I've been giving a talk at a university and a scientist came up to me afterwards and said, I've really been inspired by the way that you reach out to faith communities. I've been trying to do the same and I can't get my foot in the door. Where should I start? And each time I have asked them, well, you know, what faith tradition do you come from? What church do you attend? You know, what denomination are you part of? And each time they've said, I'm an atheist. And my response is, well, then stop.
Yeah.
You're not the right person to be talking to a faith group, but that's okay because there's somebody else who can. Why don't you talk to people who share what you're passionate about? And in the book, I tell the story of one man who, at first, when I asked him what he was passionate about, he said science. And I was like, well, of course, we're scientists. That's why we do this. But after, you know, a number of questions, he finally said, well, he was actually a very serious diver. And I said, well, don't you think divers need to know about climate change? I think they do. I am not a diver, so they will not necessarily listen to me, but you're a diver, so could you go to local PADI certification programs, because he lived on the coast, and offer your services to tell people about climate change, about how it's affecting the ocean and species, and maybe there's even some citizen science programs that divers could get involved in off the West Coast. We really have to begin where we're at. So for me, I am a Christian, and not only am I a Christian, but the reason I'm a climate scientist is because of my faith, not despite it. I was planning to be an astrophysicist. That's what my undergraduate degree is in my first 5 papers. I was planning to study this incredible universe that we live in. But when I was almost finished my undergraduate degree, I needed a breadth requirement. And I'd already taken a Spanish minor, and I'd already taken children's literature and all the interesting courses that you take to sort of fill out your breadth requirements. And so I looked around, and there was this brand new class on climate change over in the geography department. I thought, well, that looks interesting. Why not take it? And I had always thought of climate change as an environmental issue that environmentalists care about, environmentalists work on, environmentalists are going to fix, and the rest of us support them and wish them well. I didn't really consider myself an environmentalist. And I took that class, and I was completely shocked to find out that climate change is an environmental issue, but it is also a hunger issue. It's also a health issue. It's an economic issue. It's an inequality issue. It's a poverty issue. It's a human issue. Climate change is a threat multiplier affecting every problem we have today, and the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world are the ones most affected by its impacts, and that is not fair. And that was what spoke directly to my faith, because I believe that we are to love each other as we ourselves have been loved by God. And how loving is it, especially those of us living in a wealthy country, to stick our fingers in our ears essentially and say, oh, I'm not looking at the suffering that our choices are making for people who live on $1 or $2 a day. And when their crop fails, they go hungry. So that's why I became a climate scientist. And then I moved to the States. I'm Canadian.
Yep.
And I was completely shocked to find out that in the United States, often people who call themselves Christians reject the reality of a changing climate and the need to take action. And so I started to ask, why is that? Because I read the Bible. Don't they read the Bible? I mean, Book 1, Chapter 1, it says humans have responsibility over every living thing on this planet, which certainly includes plants, animals, and our fellow humans.
Yes.
And does that not mean to take care of all living things on this planet? And then at the end of the Bible, it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. That's a pretty big threat. So I started to dig into it, and what I learned is that climate denial in the United States, it might have religious window dressing on it or religious icing on it, so to speak. But the cake is political ideology. The number one factor that predicts whether people accept the simple facts that climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and action is needed, is not how educated they are. It is not how much science they know. It's not how smart they are. And it isn't even where they go to church. It's their political affiliation that determines whether they agree with the number that a thermometer is giving us.
And in your study of this, in your experience, like, when did that really get momentum? Because we were talking before we started about the beginnings of Nature Conservancy, and I just read Douglas Brinkley's new book about kind of the third wave of conservation. I actually had him on the podcast, and we were talking about, he talks a lot about LBJ and Nixon was a unbelievably effective environmental president, and he's Republican, and all those guys passed this legislation almost unanimously, some of the most important environmental legislation that's still affecting the United States today. Was it like, I mean, I'm not trying to point fingers or anything, but was the Reagan administration when all this started turning? I just don't understand when the environmental stuff got linked with religion, or the anti-environmental stuff got linked. Do you know?
Well, there were always seeds of it all along. So back when oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, there were ministers who were saying that oil was God's gift and it was our duty to extract as much oil and later as much coal and gas as possible. So there was always people who were using, and there always has been, as far back as we can go in the history of humans on this planet, there have always been people who are using religion for economic or for political gain. But the science of climate change, which has been around for a very long time, since the 1800s, we've known that digging up and burning coal back then and oil and gas today produce heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. We've been able to calculate how much the planet would warm, depending on how much of the stuff we burn, since the 1890s.
Yep.
But it didn't become politicized until we started to see the impacts. Because when it's still abstract science, something that's going to happen in the future, there's no need to do anything about it. But by the late 80s, we started to see record-breaking heat waves, Time magazine covers, James Hansen from NASA testifying to Congress that the planet was warming and that it was affecting us. And when the impact started to transition from being far away in the future to being here and now, that meant that we had to do something about it. Well, and here's the problem. 75% of the climate change that we're seeing is due to burning fossil fuels. And who are, at that time, and who were the richest companies in the world? The fossil fuel companies.
Yeah.
So the fossil fuel companies literally took a leaf from the tobacco industry. Their own scientists had been doing the calculations already for a couple of decades on how much the world would warm if we burned all of the oil and gas reserves that they were finding. They knew the exact numbers, and they realized that it was a lot cheaper to hire the spin doctors who had just lost their jobs with the tobacco industry and to muddy the waters and to delay action as long as possible than it was to change their entire business model. So that's what they did. There's this amazing book and documentary called Merchants of Doubt.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
I highly recommend it. You
Okay,
can find it
thank
on
you.
Netflix or Amazon Prime. And Merchants of Doubt explains exactly how PR specialists muddied the waters on tobacco. They muddied the waters on flame retardants on mattresses, of all things. And they muddied the waters on climate change.
Interesting.
So climate science is over 150 years old. Climate denial is less than 30 years old.
Wow. I went to school, grad and undergrad, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at Wake Forest University, which was built by Reynolds Tobacco. And I was there in the late 90s. You could put cigarettes on your meal card. Can you believe that?
No.
They let you could smoke in the mall. I didn't smoke, but like in the mall in Winston-Salem, you could go in there and light up cigarettes in like 1999.
Wow. I was going to say.
I've seen tobacco. I mean, they were on the way out then, but they still had their grip on Winston-Salem.
Yep.
I don't even know if they do anymore. I want to encourage people to read the book because it's just so awesome. But one of the big themes that I thought was so interesting that I got a lot of value from is your discussion about fear and guilt and how fear and guilt can spur action and they can make people motivated to get stuff done. But if there's too much of it, it's kind of like you're walking down a mountain ridge. If there's too much, it's going to make you just paralyzed, either paralyzed or just give up. I don't care. There's nothing I can do. Could you just give an overview of that concept? Because I think that's such a powerful thing, both for climate change, but really for any of these crazy issues that we're facing as a society right now.
Well, those chapters on fear and guilt were the hardest chapters in the whole book to write.
Were they really?
I wrote them and rewrote them and ripped them up and then called up a couple of experts who've been studying guilt and fear and then thought about them again. And really where I landed reflects social science, it reflects philosophy, and it reflects theology. Because that's really where these issues of fear and guilt come together. They are the deepest motivators of human behavior often. And when it comes to climate change, they are front and center.
Yep.
Most people in the world, and including most people in the US, are really worried about climate change. There's fear. But most of us also feel guilty about climate change. And I tell a story in the book about how I was at a retreat with a group of faith leaders in Texas. And everybody was talking about how do we get this message into Christian communities of all types, Protestant, Catholic, whatever. And after going in circles for a couple of hours, finally one Catholic man had just had it. And he just said, I have the answer. I know what we do. We just tell everybody it's a sin to drive the car. That's it. Just tell them it's a sin. And my response to that was, well, great. So I live in a place where there is no public transportation. So you're saying that when I take my son to the doctor, it's a sin?
You're sinning.
When I go to church, it's a sin? When I go to work to earn a living for my family, that's a sin? It made me so angry. And I'm a climate scientist. It made me so angry. I just wanted to go outside and look for the nearest Hummer and just drive in circles around him, leaning out the window, yelling, hello, I'm sinning. And that showed me, my own reaction showed me how unproductive it is to guilt people. And people even guilt themselves. In fact, I am very convinced that what is at the root of denial is guilt and fear. And if we can remove that and we can say, look, you've been doing your best. You didn't have other choices. You didn't know. They weren't available. You couldn't afford them. But now we know, now we do have choices. Let's talk about how we can do it differently in the future. And that is a very, it's not only a communication concept, it's a very theological concept, the idea of grace and forgiveness, forgiving ourselves as well as forgiving others, focusing on the future rather than beating ourselves up from the past. That's a core concept in many faiths, including the Christian faith. And I think that's something that's really necessary for all of us, is to acknowledge, yeah, we caused this, all of us together, but the future's in our hands. And if we obsess with guilt and fear over what we've done in the past, we are not going to fix this.
Mm-hmm. And also there's a part in that same general area of the book, if I'm remembering correctly, where you talk about this idea of purity tests.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk about that? Because I used to live in Boulder, Colorado. I live in Colorado Springs now, which is on the surface, they seem like kind of different ends of the spectrum. And I feel like there was a lot of purity tests in Boulder. And I'm open to discuss. I'm generally progressive in my thinking. I want to have my mind change. But I found even with trying to be open-minded, if somebody threw a purity test my way, even if I knew they were right, I could dig in my heels because because I'm like, this guy, nobody's going to talk to me that way.
Well, and you know why? It's because when we judge other people, we're not doing it to try to help them. We're doing it to try to make ourselves feel better.
That's right.
And so you just instinctively feel if somebody's pointing a bony finger of judgment at you, they're just doing it to make themselves feel better at your expense. And that is not nice. Mm-hmm. It is not kind. It is not compassionate. It is not conducive to any positive communication whatsoever. And we react to that. I mean, I get judged all the time. And I remember I went to the climate meeting in Egypt a couple months ago. And this man was like, oh, I bet you flew your private jet there. And I'm like, I flew EasyJet. Do you know what EasyJet is? The seats are 1 foot wide. You have to pay 25 pounds to take a miserable tiny little suitcase with you. But that judging happens all the time, but it isn't about us, it's about them. And it happens not just on one side of the spectrum, it happens on the other side too, because if people are so worried about climate change, so panicked about climate change, often when we're afraid, one of our reactions, one of our defense mechanisms is to try to control the circumstances around us. So if I feel like I could at least temporarily control someone else's behavior, it gives me a little bit of relief from my fear and my panic. Mm-hmm. So that's part of why a lot of people who are really worried about climate change go around judging other people and pointing fingers because they're trying to control other people's behavior to make themselves feel better for just a nanosecond because they are in such a dark place of despair and paralysis and anxiety. And so I completely sympathize with that. I mean, when you look at what's happening in the world, being anxious, being overwhelmed, feeling despair and panic is a very logical reaction. But what we do with those emotions is what matters. And if we turn those emotions into a way to judge others and put others down, we are never going to fix this problem. We have to focus on what we have in common, not what divides us.
I feel like you might have an extra PhD in psychology as well. Because, I mean, it's really, I mean, a lot of what you're saying, I mean, you've got all the academic papers to back everything up, but a lot of what you're saying is it's about relationships with people. And it's just about showing people respect and treating others as you'd want to be treated. And I think it's, I mean, it's simple, but not easy, I guess. When you were writing this book, I have a lot of authors on this podcast, and a lot of them say that they didn't even really know where the book was going until they started writing, and they figured stuff out and they learned stuff. Did you have any surprises that came from this book? Because obviously, I mean, you've got all the credentials you could have in these subjects. You know the data hardcore. Was there any surprises that came to you as a product of writing this book?
Yes. I think that what I learned the most was from those chapters on fear and guilt, because I knew instinctively, because I had seen that overwhelming people with fear and guilt didn't work, but I didn't know why. And I also know that sometimes fear and guilt does work, right?
Yes.
Like if somebody guilts you into doing something, like you throw a piece of garbage on the ground and somebody glares at you, most people will pick it up because they feel guilty, right? So it works. And also similarly, if there's a threat, you need to know there's a threat in order to act. If you don't know there's a threat, why would you want to do anything about it? So I knew that in some cases, fear and guilt did work, but in a lot of cases it didn't. But trying to parse out the exact circumstances under which it does or doesn't was really challenging. And I learned so much, and I had to synthesize so much literature, so much expert knowledge, my own personal experiences. And where I landed, I think it was really helpful to me because now I have a very clear understanding. Mm-hmm. I knew instinctively there was something there where it worked under some circumstances, it didn't under others. But now I know why and when it works.
Yeah.
It works when you know what to do. So if I feel afraid, but I know what to do, that fear will galvanize me to act. If I feel guilty, but I know what to do to alleviate my guilt, and it is within my power to do so, I will do it.
Yeah.
The reason why we are mired and paralyzed in fear and guilt is because we collectively don't know what to do.
And that was one thing I loved towards the end of the book. You offer plenty of potential solutions, but there's one part where you just say, the key is action. And you give options for action, but that action is a feedback loop. And the more action you take, it builds confidence. And that's like my motto in life. Sometimes I'll write that on my forearm if I'm feeling sloppy. I'll just write action. Because if I can just go and go and go, I heard somebody say mood follows action.
Yes, it does.
And so I thought that I was so glad to hear somebody so much smarter than me let me know it's okay that my message I write on my arm is good.
Well, I got it from other people who are much smarter too. And just for everybody listening, his arm is currently in a sling. So he's talking about writing action on an arm in a sling.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I hadn't been able to write it for the last 2 months because it's a silly sling, but I'll get back.
You know what else surprised me as I was writing the book is how much basic, pretty well understood psychology, like what you're just talking about is the motivation fallacy, that people want to wait to go to the gym until they feel like going to the gym. But what you have to do is you have to force yourself to go exercise and then you feel like it afterwards.
Yep.
So there's so much basic psychology that nobody had applied to understanding why people aren't acting on climate change. Mm-hmm. There were so many things I was reading where one of the most interesting books I read about 60 or 70 books and probably about 200 journal articles in writing my own book.
Do you sleep?
Well, it was during the pandemic, so I actually did a lot of reading.
Nice.
And my secret superpower is actually speed reading. I speed read because when I was a child, I loved reading. Uh-huh. I just read anything I could lay my hands on. I remember my parents ripping Quo Vadis out of my hands when I was like 9 years old. I was like, why can't I read this book? And they're like, it's not appropriate. And so I just sort of taught myself to speed read because I loved to read so much. I would read 3 books a day as a child.
Wow.
Anyways. One of the most interesting books I read a lot of very interesting books, and most of them had nothing to do with climate change, but they all had a lot to do with climate change because they talked about how we function as humans.
Yep.
There was a book called The Influential Mind written by a neuroscientist named Tali Sharot, and the entire book explained all of these features of the way our brains are fundamentally wired as humans that prevent us from acting on climate change. And that was just one example, and there were many more that I read that it is very clear that psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, social scientists, they understand a lot about how the human brain works. Mm-hmm. And it completely explains what's wrong with all of the ways that we talk about climate change or don't talk about climate change. But so much of it had never been connected before. Yep. And that really surprised me. Mm-hmm. So this past summer, I was asked to give a keynote address at the American Psychological Association.
Oh, wow.
Now, as you just said, a lot of my book is psychology, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm an atmospheric
scientist. They give you an
scientist.
honorary degree. They should.
Well, I was nervous because here I am talking to psychologists, and I sort of feel like I, stepped right into their field. And I certainly, as a scientist, did my best to cite all the studies I could. But, I am not an expert in this area. And so going there, I was actually quite nervous because I was in a session with about 5 psychologists who actually study climate anxiety and study motivation and climate action. And I arrived at the green room and I met everybody a little tentatively, like, hello, nice to meet you. And every single one of those psychologists were like, I read your book. Yes, you totally got it. That's exactly what we've been trying to tell people. This really,
That's
you
awesome.
connected the dots. And it encouraged me so much, yes, to know that this is something that psychologists know about.
Yeah.
And there is so much out there that helps people like you and me who are not psychologists be really effective at talking to people we know, because broadcast meteorologists are very effective communicators in climate change. They're very trusted. Healthcare professionals, also very trusted. Scientists, pretty trusted. But the most effective, most trusted messengers in climate change are people we know.
Yeah.
All of us have the ability to have these conversations, and that's why I wrote the book.
So speaking of that, a lot of times I will run into people just in life who start talking about climate change, and they're not in the 8%. They're smart people, but they don't, quote, believe in it for some reason, or they have all these reasons why that they saw in the news. And so out being very selfish, I want to do like role playing, and you can tell me what I should say to these folks. So
okay.
One thing that I hear a lot is, oh, well, there's just cycles in the climate. There was ice age a long time ago, and so the world gets hot, the world gets cold, and we're just in a cycle. Everything's going to be all right. And this is not a crazy person who's saying this.
No,
this
is
just a person who is that's what they think. So how would you answer that?
That is the number one most common objection. That it's just a natural cycle. And it's perfectly, you will hear it everywhere. Here's what I would say. I would say, yes, there are natural cycles, and we climate scientists are the ones who study them. And because we study them, we know that according to natural cycles right now, the Earth should be cooling, but it isn't. It's getting warmer faster and faster. And did you know, continuing right on without taking a breath.
No break, yeah.
Did you know that if we successfully tackle climate change, by 2050, we'll have saved $12 trillion?
Nice.
So what did I do there?
Yeah.
I answered their objection respectfully because it's a good objection. How do we know it isn't a natural cycle? They don't know that scientists have looked at that. Mm-hmm. So I answered it respectfully, but I also understood why they're saying it.
Yeah.
They're not saying it because they care two hoots about natural cycles. They're saying it because they don't want to fix it. They're afraid of the solutions and they feel guilty and trapped. So I wanted to immediately transition to talking about a positive, constructive solution that would make them think, wow, that's actually not bad. Tell me more about that. Mm-hmm. And if we don't do that, we're going to get mired in the, he said, she said, arguing over this and that. But if we transition to a positive solution, like, okay, give me another one, we'll do it again.
So there's really no point in the United States enacting all these laws about emissions and carbon capping and all that because China's just dumping stuff out and they're putting out more than, and they're no matter what we do, they're going to fill the atmosphere with carbon.
When you look at who's most responsible for climate change, it's the United States. The United States is responsible for almost 30% of all the heat-trapping gas emissions that are causing our planet to warm. But China is fast catching up. And that's why I'm so encouraged by the fact that China is investing so heavily in clean energy. They have more wind and solar energy than any other country in the world. And I'm really worried that the United States is being left behind. The clean energy economy is the economy of the future. Don't we want to catch up with China?
It's effective and it's true. I mean, what you say is 100. I mean, it's 100% true.
It is.
I love that. You could have been a lawyer too. What is it that you could not do?
Not at all. Thank you. That is one career that I do not envy. Also, I don't really have a strong stomach. So when I was younger, I thought a medical career is just such a great thing to be because you can help people so directly. Mm-hmm. And I just cannot.
You wouldn't like this scar on my shoulder right now.
Yeah, no.
One question that I have, and I want your clear, measured, yet optimistic thoughts on it, is when COVID hit, that was very acute and it was very science-based, and we needed to come together and find a science-based solution for that. And no matter what you think about COVID, I think everybody can agree that it was a bit of a mess and it polarized people. Mm-hmm. And so when I get down in the dumps, and then I need to write action on my arm to snap out of it, I think, well, if we can't get COVID right or can't come together on COVID, how are we going to deal with climate change, which if you dig in the data, you realize is serious, but for the average American, it's there's more hurricanes in the Florida coast, or there are more wildfires in Colorado where we are now. So, how do you think about that when the lessons learned from COVID? Do you apply any of those to your thoughts about climate change?
I do, and I was writing the book during COVID. So the introduction to the book actually starts off with talking about the political polarization I saw with COVID and how it was no surprise to me at all because it followed the exact same pathways as the polarization over climate change. In fact, one of my favorite cartoons is a cartoon of these two medical scientists standing there talking to each other saying, well, if we just tell the American public the facts about coronavirus, and then in the background you see this climate scientist literally rolling on the ground laughing, pointing at them because we know that isn't the way it works. And with COVID, it was even more difficult because the science was new. Do you remember when it first started, they didn't even know if it was airborne or if it was passed by touch. So we were washing our hands. We were washing our groceries. Do you remember that?
Amazon boxes.
Leaving Amazon boxes outside the door for a day or two to make sure.
We were talking about, my wife and I were talking about that the other day. It was crazy.
We didn't know. They didn't even recommend masks at first because they didn't realize it was airborne. And then you have all these companies struggling to develop vaccines, and they're doing these tests at warp speed to see if they're safe. So that was an incredible example of science being done at warp speed. But because it was being done at warp speed, typically stuff that gets debated among scientists in the literature was instead being debated in the public forum, like to mask or not to mask, or was it passed by touch or was it passed in the air?
Yep.
And now, today, obviously, we do know a lot of the answers, but we still don't know all the answers. The difference is that climate change has been studied for, like I said, over 150 years.
Yeah.
We have looked at every other factor that could be causing the planet to warm. Natural cycles, volcanoes, the sun, the heat inside the earth, even unknown factors. We know without a shadow of a doubt it is human caused. And we know that it's affecting real people today. Mm-hmm. We can put numbers on how much more area is being burned by a wildfire because of a changing climate. We can put numbers on how much more rain a hurricane is dumping because of a changing climate. We can even put numbers on how many dollars climate change is costing us in the billions and the trillions because climate change is making these severe weather events worse. So there are many parallels between climate change and COVID. And certainly the reactions fell out along the exact same ideological lines. But with climate change, because we've been studying it so long, that scientific debate is no longer happening. Mm-hmm. There is certainly people trying to debate it on social media, but they're not trying to debate it based on facts or science. They're trying to debate it because they don't want to fix it.
Sure.
But here's the thing, and here's where the guilt comes in. If I say, sure, it's real, and it's affecting real people today, especially the poorest and most vulnerable people, and it will also affect our children and grandchildren even more, but I don't want to fix it, that makes me a bad person. And most people do not want to be a bad person. Mm. So our defense mechanisms, mostly subconsciously, will then kick in and say, okay, I am not a bad person. And so if I'm not a bad person, then this thing must not be real, because if it were real, I would want to fix it. But if I don't want to fix it, then it can't be real. And so we go out and we look for excuses like volcanoes or China or secret conspiracy theories. But those are just excuses. It's like, the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
You got to look behind the curtains. And when you look behind the curtains, what you see is, I don't want to fix it because I'm afraid of what people have told me the solutions are. Mm-hmm. And that's why showing people that solutions can benefit them is so important. We have to talk about practical solutions that help us today as well as in the future.
Your parents, I'm very curious in how everybody I have on the podcast, like how they ended up doing this work they do, because everybody's so passionate about it and they're so driven. It's almost like there's nothing else in the world they could do because they're so obsessed with what they're doing. Mm-hmm. There was one part in your book, just a sentence, where it talked about y'all lived in Colombia. It was more than a sentence, and I was curious. I'd hardly ever been abroad, and at age 30, I moved to Central America for a year, and it was one of the most formative experiences of my life, mm-hmm. as far as getting out of the United States, looking from the outside in, getting different perspectives. Do you look back at that experience as formative as far as your ability to think for yourself and not get caught up in just whatever is happening? And, you're able to kind of back up a little bit?
It was very formative to me to move to Colombia when I was 9 years old. Because what it showed me was how vulnerable people are to disaster when they're living on the edge. Here we have insurance. Mm-hmm. We have weather forecasts. There's the National Guard. There's all kinds of cushions in society that protect us. When the crops fail, there's still food in the grocery store.
Sure.
When disaster strikes, we have a car that we could get away in and money to stay in a hotel maybe. Not everybody does here, but most of us feel like we have at least some type of cushion or protection. But when you're living in a low-income country and you see that people live off $1 or $2 a day, and when the rains come, their home is washed away and they have no way to rebuild.
That's it.
When the crops fail, they have no way to feed their family, and the devastating choice might be to sell their daughter into a child marriage so the rest of the family doesn't starve, or all starve together. When you see those things happening to real people who are just the same as you, it is just an accident of birth, who was born where and who was born in the other place. It makes you understand this matters. This matters to real people. There, but for the grace of God go I, and there maybe go some people I love. How can we not care, any of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter what our faith tradition may or may not be, just as a human being, how can we not care when people are being affected like that? And so growing up with friends, living in homes that they built with bricks that they bought 10 at a time when everybody went out to work, and on Saturday they would come home with the bricks and they would build it, and then finally they had one full room built for a family with 8 children, and they would invite everybody for a huge party with Coke and cake because... Yeah. Coca-Cola, to be specific. It was Colombia, but it was still Coca-Cola. Because it was such a tremendous step forward to have a brick room to live in.
Sure.
That would protect you when the rains come. And that's what we don't realize, is that climate change is a threat multiplier. And it is a threat multiplier not just for people, but for nature also. When we look at deforestation, habitat loss, extinction threats, zoonosis, the transfer of diseases from animals to humans, when we look at all of the challenges that face the natural world today, the natural world of which we are part, climate change is a threat multiplier. It's exacerbating all of those impacts on the biosphere on which our life depends. The planet does not need us. We need it.
Yeah, that's one thing I always think about with this is there's an argument that working to fight against climate change and remedy climate change could be seen as a very selfish act. We're protecting our house. It's made out to be this thing that you're trying to help the world and all that, but it could be seen as very selfish too, and that'd be an effective way to go about it. It's like we're on a ship, and the ship is getting holes in it, and we better fix it or it's going down.
That's right, and the ocean will still be there.
The ocean will still be there, won't even blink.
Well, the reason why I'm fighting, and the reason why I feel like everybody has the reason to fight, is because of the places I love, the things I love, and the people I love.
Well, and I think that's why you're so effective with it, because it is from this pure place and a positive place, and people are drawn to that. People don't want to hear. Sometimes you got to hear the bad news, and but I feel like for what you do and being able to tell this message across so many millions and millions and millions of people, it's a message of hope and love. And I think it has to be that to connect with people on a broad scale, I think.
I agree.
So you are now with the Nature Conservancy as well, and I just don't understand how you do so much. It's very impressive to me. I'm obsessed with Theodore Roosevelt, and that's one of the reasons I'm obsessed with him is because of how much he was able to but he had a lot of servants. And so that would help, wouldn't it? That's my excuse. I don't have any servants.
Primarily DIY.
Yeah. So talk to me about your decision to work with Nature Conservancy, because I feel like your academic credentials are so deep. You're so gifted, if you could be a psychiatrist if you want, lawyer, but you don't want to be. Why TNC? What attracted you to this organization?
Well, I am still a professor at Texas Tech University, and I had never really wanted to do anything else because I so much valued my independence and my ability to speak to so many different audiences about the urgency of climate action. With the Nature Conservancy, though, what makes it unique, and there's many good groups around the world who are doing fantastic work, and I partner with many of them. I'm a Oxfam Sister of the Planet. I serve as an advisor to everybody from natural history museums to Christian organizations, groups that work with young people. But what's really unique about the Nature Conservancy is it's the biggest conservation organization in the world. TNC works in 80 countries around the world, including every state in the U.S. as well. And it is a big tent organization. It's all about finding what we have in common rather than what divides us, and crafting practical, real-world solutions with benefits today as well as benefits for climate and biodiversity tomorrow. And that is exactly what we need more of.
Mm-hmm. As we were talking about before we started recording, I worked at a regional conservation group, and TNC in Colorado was just such a great partner. Mm-hmm. And they're really good at bringing people together. And then when you look at their mission, I think one of the bullet points below the mission statement is non-confrontational. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's pretty unique because, like I said, there is a need for confrontation sometimes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I feel like you're going to have that big tent when you've got the non-confrontational side of things. When you think about being able to work with TNC and being able to kind of corral all these different resources that TNC has across the globe, what sort of impact are you looking to make?
One of the other things I love about the Nature Conservancy is that it is a science-based organization. You ask anyone what makes TNC unique, and they will say it is based on science. And I love that because science tells us how the world works. Science doesn't tell us what's the right thing to do. That's where we need our hearts. We need our values. But science says, if we make this decision, here's what's going to happen. And we don't have time to waste making decisions that don't yield the results that we need for climate, for biodiversity, and for people. We need to be making the best choices that we can, informed by that science. And so at the Nature Conservancy, we've just been counting our scientists. And it turns out we have over 700 scientists
That's
working
amazing.
in 80 countries around the world.
700.
700 scientists, all working on protecting the land and the water on which all life depends, all working towards our very ambitious 2030 goals, which include protecting freshwaters, protecting ocean, protecting land, and protecting 100 million vulnerable people who are being impacted by climate disasters. And what I want to do is I want to help us work together even more closely, because you might have one scientist in one part of the world studying, how restoring coastlines protects the people who are living there in the small villages, and mangrove forests help to provide habitat for the fish that they depend on, as well as firewood for their homes. Well, if they're studying that over in Papua New Guinea, and then they might be studying that over on the other side of the world, they need to get together and figure out, hey, this worked over here, let's try it over there. Or this really didn't work over here, and here's why. Let's not bother trying it over there. We really need to be working together and learning from each other, all of us as humans. Mm-hmm. And I think the Nature Conservancy is really sort of a microcosm of humans, because we work in so many countries on so many different projects with so many people and so many types of organizations, really figuring out how to work together in a science-based way. That's the catalyst that's going to accelerate all of the actions that we need to, like I said, really tackle the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis at scale.
So you're a genius when it comes to statistics and quantitative things. When 5 years from now, if you look back quantitatively, if you could measure it, how would you, what stats would you want to see to feel like, all right, I had the impact that I hoped I was going to have over that 5-year period with TNC?
Oh, that's a good question. So I have been measuring statistics on my communication.
Nice.
And I still remember the very first time I was invited to speak at Houghton College, which is a small Wesleyan college in upstate New York.
Okay.
And I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't come because I only travel when I bundle multiple events together. And frankly, Houghton College is in the middle of nowhere, and there was no bundling to be had. Yeah. There is one gas station, and that is it within an hour's drive.
You go to people at the pumps and give them a little...
Right. But then the guy who invited me, Brian Webb, said, the reason why I want you to come is because I'm doing my master's degree as part of the Harvard Extension program, and I want to test whether speaking to students makes a difference or not. And I thought to myself, my goodness, why haven't we done this before? Why am I wasting my time talking to people about climate change if it makes no difference? But I was thinking of something else at that time, and this was 10 years ago. I was thinking, what if I transition most of what I do to online?
Yep.
Because I was thinking of significantly reducing my carbon footprint, this is long before COVID, by transitioning over 80% of the talks I did to online talks. And this is back in the day when nobody else was doing it. There was no Zoom even in those days.
Yeah, isn't that
Skype.
funny? Yeah,
yes.
It was just Skype.
But I figured I could really radically reduce my carbon footprint if I did that, and I could be more effective. I could do more talks in less time. So I said, well, Brian, can we try something else? Would we be able to test whether a video produces the same result as an in-person talk? And he said, oh, yeah. So we designed this whole experiment where he asked students about 36 questions, the 6 America questions beforehand. And then as the students showed up for the talk, they were funneled into a room that had me in person, or they were funneled into a room randomly that had me with a recorded video that I had made the previous day, sticking as closely as possible to what I was going to say in the other room.
Yep.
So they were getting the same thing. And I still remember I met up with Brian in June at the Citizens Climate Lobby annual meeting. I was one of the speakers, and he was one of the delegates. And we sat down in the hallway of the hotel. He put up his laptop. He had this Excel spreadsheet full of thousands of numbers. And he said, I have the answer. And I was nervous.
Sure.
I was like, what if I've just been wasting my time this whole time thinking I'm telling people about why this matters? It does. They don't care. Of the 36 questions that he asked them about climate change, about do you agree it's real? Is it important? Do we need to fix it? There were statistically significant improvements on all but one question. 35 out of 36 questions. And there was no statistically significant difference between the video versus in person.
Wow. That's really neat.
That's when I started doing my global weirding series on YouTube. Yeah. That's when I transitioned all my talks to online. Because we can use the tools that we have. So those are the statistics I do know about communication.
I think that's great.
And I've done more of those since then. I've done a study with Yale where we did short 1.5-minute videos on climate change from a conservative perspective, and we aired them in purple states, lots of Democrats and Republicans, and we looked at how Democrat and Republican opinions changed. Mm-hmm. And it turns out if you frame things from a conservative perspective, conservative opinions change more.
Wow.
It actually works in real life on Facebook and YouTube. But at the Nature Conservancy, that's a great question. I'm going to think about it a little bit more because I should write down these statistics. But I would love to see statistics on, I think our mission will succeed if we're seeing collaborations.
Yes.
across geographies where people would otherwise not be connected. So imagine if there's a scientist in Colorado and they're writing something with one of our scientists from South Africa. How did they find that scientist? Through the program that we've built to help people find each other if they're working on the same things.
Not that you need my approval, but you're just so uniquely qualified to combine the statistical number crunching with the relationship side of things. I feel like that's a really unique skill set that you're very, very good at. A few more questions. You are going to be speaking tonight. We're sitting here in Steamboat Springs, beautiful, just a few, we're probably 50 yards from the Yampa River maybe. Mm-hmm. And you're speaking to a group tonight. When you think about the American West and everything that, with the wildfires, all the different climate-based issues that we're dealing with out here, what comes to your mind? Like, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about the challenges and opportunities of the arid West?
Well, first of all, I love that you said challenges and opportunities because there are opportunities as well as challenges. So, for example, when you look at which states have the greatest wind energy potential, it is right up the middle of the United States. So it's not the states that had the massive oil and gas resources that have the energy of the future. Uh-oh. With the exception of Texas.
Yeah.
Yes. So there's tremendous potential for local jobs in clean energy. There's tremendous potential for things like rare earth mineral mining and processing that we need for a lot of this new technology. There's tremendous potential for building more resilient and more healthy and livable cities. Mm-hmm. Cities that are prepared for more extreme heat, more extreme rain. They're prepared to weather drought. But they're also much more livable, much more walkable, reduced air pollution, much more efficient. We're not so wasteful with our food or our energy or our water. We're saving money through a lot of these actions. There's so many benefits today from climate actions that also benefit us tomorrow that I think if people really understand the opportunities, a lot of times people are just kind of like, well, why aren't we doing that anyways? Mm-hmm. But the risks is that if we continue the way we've currently been living, it is unsustainable. More precipitation is falling as rain and less the snow. And that means that nice snowpack, which provides a lot of the water supply in the summer, is getting less and less. We also see that heat is increasing. That means more water evaporation from streams and reservoirs.
Yep.
We also see that what type of crops you can grow where and when and how are shifting. Species are moving. We see all of these challenges, but there are also opportunities. And if we realize that the future, a better future, is still truly within our grasp, but only if we do everything we can to get there. And we need to do that for all of us, because when it all comes down to it, when we talk about what we have in common, what do we share the most? We all want a better future.
Yes.
We're not going to get there if we don't tackle climate change.
I agree. Two more questions for you. You read a lot, obviously.
I do.
Speed reading. And do you ever just sit back and enjoy it, just like read a novel or something? Or when you sit down to read, are you on a mission? Because I'm always kind of on a mission when I'm reading.
No, I read for pleasure.
Do you really?
Yes. I do not read climate fiction.
Okay.
There's a lot of dystopian fiction out there about how the world's going to hell in a handbasket. I do not read that because I read the real thing.
Yes.
I don't want any more.
You don't need an interpretation.
No, I read for enjoyment, for pleasure, for distraction, for a slice of the world that has nothing to do with what I actually study in real life.
Can you give me a book that is one of the more important books in your trajectory, professional, personal trajectory, just a book that you love, that you think, and then maybe a book that you've recently read that you liked?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, as I was writing Saving Us, I read a lot of really good books like The Righteous Mind, that explains how we all have morals, but we just express them very differently. Books like, The Master and the Elephant, that explain how we as humans react to things in two different ways and process things very differently. The book I referred to earlier, The Influential Mind, that really unpacks how fear does or doesn't motivate us to act. And I loved all those books because I just feel like they explain so much of what we see in everyday life, right? But in terms of a book I've read recently, I was just in Egypt for the climate meeting in November. And I had read quite a long time ago, but I just went back and I reread this phenomenal series that was written by a professional Egyptologist at the University of Chicago. She wrote a fictional series on two Egyptologists in the late 1800s, early 1900s, back in the days when they were discovering King Tut's tomb and things like that. And so it was just so entertaining and so interesting. And it had lots of information in it, but also it was right in the place where I was. It's called the Amelia Peabody series. Okay. People listening might be familiar with it. But I just really love reading about people who have such joy in what they're doing. I don't want to read about people who it's just more doom and more gloom because there's so much of that already in everything I read scientifically. But just things that, not just reading, but also doing things like spending time with people I love, out in nature doing things I love, making food for people I love. I love knitting. Buying new yarn and making things for people I love. I just made a little sweater for one of my colleagues' sons.
You can make a sweater? That's,
yeah.
That's real deal.
Yes.
I've knitted scarves before, but never a sweater. My daughter's getting interested in it, though. I might need to call you up for lessons.
It's so fun.
That's amazing.
I knit blankets, too.
Wow.
Just doing things, and that includes some of the reading I do, doing things that bring us joy is really, really important. One of my colleagues, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, works in oceans and climate, and she has conceptualized and sort of quantified a concept that I've sort of lived my life by for a long time. When you think about where you should be, it's a combination of what needs to be done, what you are uniquely good at, because each of us has skills that other people don't have, and I love the third circle, what brings you joy. And right there in the middle of what needs to be done, what you're good at, and what gives you joy, that's what each of us needs to be doing.
That is a perfect way to end this. Thank you so much for this. I'm so pleased to meet you. I felt like I already knew you because I listened to you read your book. I've watched YouTube videos. I listened to you on podcasts. I read your book. It's a great book. The end notes are amazing. About 50 pages, 47 pages of end notes. So keep up.
But people can skip them if they want to. They don't have to read them.
Yeah, I'm the weirdo digging through those. But thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for taking the time. This was a real honor to meet you, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.